For this week's review, we'll be taking a look at this Bible. It's a Douay-Rheims Bible, printed by Tan Books. I've had it for about 30 years. It's a hardback. It's leather or imitation leather over boards. It has a bit of a flex to it, as you can see. Pose it for the cover picture. Crosses on the front side and the back side. There's kind of a neat indentation around the outside of the cross to give it more character. You can see that if I angle it right. It has tooled lines around the sides too, and decorative images here in the corners. Kind of hard to see. It also has yellow edges and no ribbon marker. It has bands that are kind of yellow and black or yellow and dark gray. Maybe they're white and dark gray. The dimensions of the book: it is 8 and 5/16 inches tall, 6 and 5/16 inches wide, and almost 3 inches thick. It's 2 and 15/16 inches thick. And to give you a sense for the size, here is my cameo, which also contains the Apocrypha, like the Douay-Rheims. So it's quite a large book. Not very tall, not very wide, but considerably thick. So we go inside. It's a normal hardback type binding, 1 page of heavy paper, and then you get to the approbation by His Eminence James Cardinal Gibbons, given on the 1st of September 1899. He says the sacred volume is printed in an attractive style. This particular one, as you'll see, was not printed in 1899, but you can see from the receipt here that I bought it on the 9th of May 1986 at the Giving Tree, which was a Christian bookstore in a mall to the northwest of Dayton. In a mall, shopping plaza that was in that vicinity. Title page, translated from the Latin Vulgate. This is the Douay-Rheims, but it's also not the original Douay-Rheims, and we'll talk about that quite a bit as we go on. This is the 1750-1752 Challoner update, not the original published at Douay in 1609. And the Old Testament Rheims in 1582, translated into English from the Latin Vulgate. And it's, as it says, it's approved by James Cardinal Gibbons. What we have here is a photographic reproduction of the 1899 edition that John Murphy Company of Baltimore, Maryland put out. If you remember your American history, Maryland was the center of Catholicism in America in the early days. Printed and bound in the United States of America, and you could, at the time, 30 years ago, order it directly from Tan Books and publishers. Tan Books still produces the Douay-Rheims Bible. I do not own a recent one, but I think their quality may have gone down considerably. The paper here is nice and thick, and it is not reflective. How thick is it? I measured it to be 66.7 micrometers thick. That gives me an estimated paper weight of something like 61 GSM. Not a lot of show through here either, as you can see on the back side here. I think you might be able to see some in the back here. You can, I think, read the Holy Bible, but that's very bold and large. So here we are at Genesis, and this is what Genesis looks like in the 1752 Douay-Rheims Bible. You should be seeing about now an overlay from the 1635 printing of the original Douay-Rheims that shows you what that looked like. Now here, you can see we have double columns now, but in the original they had a single column. We have verse by verse now. They had paragraph by paragraph then. So the format changed quite a lot, and of course we now have the modern characters. Flipping forward here, Well, let me just say that the notes here are rather skimpy, but the notes to chapter 1 of Genesis, which you should be seeing on your screen a sample of, were very detailed. There was a page of notes in the original Douay-Rheims Bible following each chapter of the Bible. Okay, let's go forward. We'll go past Ezekiel. We just flipped over most of the apocryphal books, but here we are in 2nd Maccabees. Notice how they spelled Maccabees in those days. Come to Matthew. Each book of the Bible does not start on its own page in this. After 1,086 pages of the Old Testament, we have family register pages. And then you get to the New Testament and the Gospel according to Matthew. And again, I will show you the original Matthew. This is from the 1635 printing. It's a single column again. Alright, so here we are in the New Testament. It's a black letter text here. As I say, the newer tan ones I think are on skinny paper with pink letters. At least this is what I gather from the reviews. I have not seen one in the flesh. There's some page non-uniformity. We can show that here pretty easily. If we get to pages 255 and 257, I'll show those side by side. And you can see it's lighter on the right, darker on the left. That's the kind of thing one finds in this book throughout. After the end of the Apocalypse of St. John, which is here, very end, there's a historical and chronological index of the Old Testament, which indicates, based on its works in the Anno Mundi, the year of the world system. So Adam was created in year 1, and Christ comes on the scene somewhere around 4,000 years later. It doesn't go adding forward all the way to Christ. It goes to King Hezekiah in 3277 Anno Mundi. Well, it goes past that. I'm wrong. It goes all the way to Alexander Hyrcanus in 3934. And then the New Testament chronology begins with year 1. Christ is born at Bethlehem. And no, of course, that happened more like 4 BC. Table of references after the chronology. And just note here it says references on the topic of the eternity of hell's torments. I think there's a good possibility that Pope Francis was unaware of this. I'm not sure how he would react. Table of all the epistles and gospels. This is a table of readings. So in the Catholic Mass, these are the things, the epistle and the gospel reading that would have been read in the pre-Vatican II era, before they changed the Mass. In those days, there was one epistle reading and one gospel reading, and they repeated every year. These days, they have a 3-year cycle, and they read from the Old Testament as well. So this wouldn't do you much good today, unless you were going to one of the masses where they're still doing the Latin, the Tridentine masses. Then after all of that, and there's also a table of contents for the books of the Bible, order of the books and the number of their chapters. You have black and white maps in this reprint. I actually picked up in a library a few years ago an old copy that had belonged to someone who was a heavy smoker. This thing reeked of tobacco for a number of years, but I let it air out long enough that it no longer smells, and it shows you the same maps in a slightly different order and gives you a sense for what they originally looked like. So they were old style. They kind of remind me of the 1901 American Standard Version Bibles. Maps, kind of hard to read. Not much contrast in places, but quite detailed. Trying to show you topographic details and features. So maps, there are 9 maps spanning 8 pages. Alright, so that's our tour, our overview, and we'll come back and we'll look at some things in more detail, and then towards the end, after we do that, we're going to look at certain quotations from the Douay-Rheims Bible and see if those, since this is a Catholic Bible, match up well with the Westcott and Hort tradition, because after all, the Westcott and Hort text is supposed to be a Jesuitical text, at least according to certain people. So we'll see if in fact Westcott and Hort and the Catholic Bible agree. Now I have the Douay-Rheims Bible, the Tan Publications book from about 30 years ago, on a stand, and just want to point out certain features here. The titles of the books are at the top center, page numbers here on the outside. There's a chapter number on the inside towards the gutter. It is in, as we've said many times now, it's a verse-by-verse format like the King James Version, because that's what Richard Challoner wanted to do when he updated the book in the 1750s, is he wanted to make it appealing, and what was appealing in those days was the King James format. Has 2 columns of text. Each column is 59 millimeters wide. So each of these is about 59 millimeters wide. There are about 41 characters that they can squeeze into there. You can get up to 57 lines of text here in the page. Page dimensions are, it is 203 millimeters tall, 150 millimeters wide, or 8 inches tall, and 5.9 inches wide. We have some margins. Now count the margin from the tops of capital letters here to the edge. So the margin includes things like the book title. Margin at the top is 10 millimeters. At the bottom it's about 11. That's below here, below the notes at the bottom of the page. The inside margin is about 7 millimeters and the outer is about 18. Now it's hard to get to the inner margin here because this book tends to curl up and out. And personally, although I've not been able to prove it to myself, because of all the glue there, and because I've not seen any evidence of stitching, I think this book is glued. Okay, font. When I look at it with my overlay, it comes out to be about an 8-point Georgia. I use Georgia because these letters spread out kind of the way the Georgia letters do. They're not upright and close the way they are in the Times New Roman. The notes at the bottom are close to a 7-point. If you calculate the font size in the pica system, you get about 8.9 points. So it's around 8 points in Georgia, but about 8.9 mathematically. Let's look closely now. I'm going to pull over another page, and we're going to zoom in. Alright, that's not bad. Get a little bit more light on the page. So, I think the line spacing is pretty good. I don't see a lot of overlap. These L here and the J seem to have room between them. It feels comfortable to my eye, also because it's double column, and these columns are not very broad, so I don't get into the middle of the page and feel claustrophobic with the 2 lines squeezing in on each other. So the line spacing, I think, is quite adequate. The tracking looks good. The spaces between the letters are nice and relaxed. Supplied words here are in oblique type, and those are kind of rare, and quotations from the Old Testament are in oblique type as well. I will flip back a few pages and show you that. Let's look here in Acts chapter 7, we have some quotations right here. So you can see here, and said to him, go forth out of thy country and from thy kindred and come into the land. So they use an oblique type there for quotations. And they use an oblique type for supplied words. Here, for instance, as your fathers did, so do you also. So both did and do were supplied by the translators there in 751, Acts 7:51. Okay, back here to Colossians. And we're going to be here for the next section. So I've set us up here deliberately to talk about this verse, because this is a good segue into the notes at the bottom of the page. Back in the 1980s, I had a very nice old Roman Catholic priest tell me that, in fact, Christ's suffering wasn't sufficient, and we have to fill up the remainder of the satisfaction to God, which Christ didn't do on the cross. And he pointed me to Colossians 1:24 to explain that. We have to fill up those things that are wanting of the sufferings of Christ. It's kind of interesting here that the Douay-Rheims Bible isn't very strong on that in its notes. It says, there is no want in the sufferings of Christ in himself as head, but many sufferings are still wanting or still to come in his body, the church, and his members, the faithful. Well, so that's just, to me, that strikes me as simply a prediction of the future, that we will undergo suffering, which I don't think anyone would disagree with. But take a look here. This is an annotation from chapter 1 of Colossians from the 1635 edition of the Douay-Rheims Bible. Look at all those words. One thing you notice is that they did change the translation. In the 1635 and earlier editions, it said do accomplish rather than fill up. So the fill up to accomplish change was made. So in 1635 edition, it said accomplish that which wants, and it goes on and on about how our sufferings are meritorious and satisfactory, notwithstanding the vain clamors of the Protestants. So it was much more polemic in 1635. Penal and satisfactory works of Christ and his members, but it's this notion that our sufferings are satisfactory to God, and that they supplement Christ's satisfaction on the cross. I've taken us over to John 21:17. This is another favorite, this is a favorite passage of Catholics to prove the supremacy of St. Peter and his successors in Rome. Christ is giving Simon the charge to feed his sheep, but the note here is not especially polemical. It doesn't make a very strong case at all. It says the Lord promised the spiritual supremacy to St. Peter. It gives a reference to Matthew. Here he fulfills that promise by charging him with the superintendency of all his sheep without exception, and consequently of his whole flock, that is, of his own church. But that leaves quite a lot. So even if we were to admit that that's what the verse is about, giving Peter supremacy, what then? What does that say about Francis in Rome today? I would say. Well, when I was in the first grade, a fortunate thing happened for my future. We moved from one state to another, and in the state I had been in, I was learning to read with the sight reading system. And I moved to a new school where they did phonics, so I had a lot of catching up to do because I didn't know what a diphthong was or anything like that. But in the new school in Texas, that's where it was, at recess, some of the kids stayed behind and they had religious education. So I got there in January and it was very cold outside, and the first time they did that, I thought, well, okay, I'll stay back for this religious education. the teacher didn't really want me to unless I was something called a Catholic. She was using these terms Catholic and Protestant, and she asked me which one I was. I didn't know. So she did a test. She had us all recite the Lord's Prayer. And at the very end of it, I belted out, and thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. And then she said, you're a Protestant, and she sent me outside to play. I told her that it was in the Bible, but she said, no, it's in your Bible. The implication being that my Bible was faulty and that hers was good. Nowadays we have King James onlyists who say that the Westcott and Hort Bible is a Jesuit Bible, it's a Catholic Bible, and therefore to be shunned. So what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is look at a few passages. Yes, I've cherry-picked them, and yes, there are some other passages that go the other way. But in these cases, at least, you'll see that the Douay-Rheims Bible lines up nicely with the King James Version and not with the Westcott and Hort text from the 1881 Revised Version. This first instance, the Lord's Prayer, in fact, it is correct to say that the Douay-Rheims Bible and the Revised Version agree, and on the basis of this one text alone, where the Douay-Rheims does not include thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, amen, you would say that the Revised Version, maybe it is being influenced by the Catholic Douay-Rheims Bible. But we'll look at some other examples and we'll see that that's not generally true. Now here's the second example. We're at Mark chapter 6, verse 20. The Douay-Rheims says, Herod feared God, knowing him to be a just and holy man, and kept him, and when he heard him did many things, and he heard him willingly. So I'll bring up my graphic, and the Douay-Rheims is in the center again. And if you look it in the King James Version, both say he did many things. Herod did many things after he heard John, presumably many things that John told him to do. Or maybe many things that he did to try to make atonement for his wickedness. But look at the 1881 Revised Version on the left. It says, he was much perplexed. Well, the much perplexed there comes from the old uncial manuscripts that they had available there. There are, in these examples, there are sometimes papyri that back up the Westcott and Hort reading as well, but I don't think they had those at the time. So in the little box at the bottom, when I say it's based largely upon, that's because I believe that they only had those uncials then at the time. So here we have an alignment, but the alignment is with Douay-Rheims is with the King James Version against the Revised Version. So here, if the Revised Version is Catholic, does that mean that the Douay-Rheims Version is Protestant? So here's our third look. This is Mark 15:39. This is Jesus is dying on the cross. He's cried out with a loud voice. Having cried out with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost. The veil of the temple was rent. And the centurion who stood over against him, seeing that crying out in this manner, he had given up the ghost, said, indeed, this man was the Son of God. So I think he was impressed by Jesus crying out so loudly and so forcefully, and that somehow impresses him that the guy really was the Son of God. He has so much energy at the moment of death. So here we have the graphic, and you see that the center column, the Douay-Rheims, says crying out, and the King James Version said cried out. The centurion in both instances has witnessed Jesus crying out, and the reason that he's saying what he says, indeed this man was the Son of God, has to do with that sight, that observation. You look to the left, with the supposedly Jesuitical 1881 Revised Version, and it does not include crying out at all. So here we have another Douay-Rheims King James Version alignment against the 1881 Revised Version. Okay, another example, Luke 9:55 through 56. This time they're traveling through Samaria. The Samaritans do not receive them. His disciples, John and James, saw this. They say, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? And turning, he rebuked them, saying, You know not of what spirit you are. The Son of Man came not to destroy souls, but to save. And they went into another town. So here's the graphic. And you see again the 1752 Douay-Rheims Catholic Bible and the King James Version Bible agree, and the 1881 Revised Version leaves out all of that language about what Jesus said. You know not what spirit ye are of. Son of Man has come not to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Another alignment with the Catholic Bible and the King James Version against the Revised Version. One might almost begin to suspect that the King James Version is the Catholic Bible, and the 1881 Revised Version is the Protestant Bible. But again, don't draw those conclusions just on the basis of a few quotations here and there. One would have to look at them all and do a statistical analysis. Next example, Luke 23:38. Jesus is on the cross. And saying, If thou be the King of the Jews, save thyself. And there was also a superscription written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, This is the King of the Jews. But if we look at the 1881 Revised Version, the words having to do with the languages the superscription was written in are not there. That's because they're not in the text that Westcott and Hort decided was the best text, Vaticanus. But the Vulgate provides them. The Douay-Rheims is based on the Vulgate, which Jerome prepared back in the 5th century, I think, 400s. But it has these words in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, just like the King James Version does. So again, another alignment between the Catholic Bible and the King James Bible against the edition that's based on a critical text. John chapter 5 verse 4, Did the angel stir the water? Angel descended into the pool in certain times, moved the water, and the first person into the pool was made whole of whatever infirmity he lay under. This helps explain why the man later on says that he can't get cured because he can't get into the water first when it's troubled. Without verse 4, the whole thing doesn't make much sense. Well, the 1881 Revised Version and most of its later followers in the English translation world do not include verse 5:4. And why? Because it's not on the unsealed manuscripts and the few modern papyri, old papyri found in more modern times, that don't include it. But the Douay-Rheims Bible aligns with the King James Bible because the manuscripts that they're translated from do include it. And this language is absolutely ancient because if you note there in the white box, Tertullian, I don't call him a church father because he died as a heretic, but he was an early Christian writer. I think he died as a Montanist. But he died in 240, and sometime while he was still alive, in his book on baptism, he makes a clear reference to the stirring of the water by the angel. It's really an old passage, and why it's not in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, I do not know. Here we are in Acts. This is chapter 8, verses 36, 37, and so on, when Philip is explaining the scriptures, Isaiah passage to the Ethiopian eunuch, and the eunuch learns about Jesus, and they went on their way. They came to a certain water, and the eunuch said, See, here's water. What doth hinder me from being baptized? And Philip said, If thou believest with all thy heart, thou mayest. And he answering said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And they stopped the chariot, and they both went down into the water, and Philip baptized the eunuch. So here's our graphic, and you see the Douay-Rheims there in the center column, agreeing very nicely with the King James Version to the right. And the entire verse, 837, is not in the 1881 Revised Version. And why? Because it's not in 3 of the large unsealed manuscripts that they had available. There is, again, I want to mention, it's not just those, it's based largely on those. If you look in your UBS 5, you'll see many other attestations to the absence of the verse. But I think it was there. Irenaeus quotes the verse in Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 12, Section 8. And you can find that in your Ante-Nicene Fathers on Volume 1, page 433. And Irenaeus died in 202. So I don't know what's going on, but I know it's more, at least based on what I've shown you, I think one could well draw the conclusion that the Revised Version is not mindlessly following some sort of a Roman Catholic model. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Bible and the King James Bible agree in a good number of places. But again, you wouldn't want to draw any global conclusions without looking at all the places where there are variations and seeing what percentage of times the different books agree. I just wanted to show these because I think they're quite striking. This pretty much wraps up my review of the 30-year-old Tan publications, Douay-Rheims Bible, the 1752 version of Douay-Rheims based on Challoner's work. Tan still produces the Douay-Rheims. From what I read, the paper's too thin, the red letters, which I wish there weren't any of, fade, and it's not very high quality. There's somebody called Loretto Publications that also produces the Douay-Rheims. I don't know anything about them, but they might be worth investigating. If I were a Roman Catholic today, I certainly would, but I think what I would look for would be a paper copy of the 1635 edition, because it's so much more interesting. The notes are detailed and polemical in nature, and I think that's good, that we have honest discussions about where we disagree. I also would probably be a sedevacantist, because I would see how the Roman Catholic religion has changed over the last 50, 60 years, and if it was true once, then it would still be true, the old version of truth. I would probably want to use Douay-Rheims Bible because of this statement from the Council of Trent, the 4th session, 8 April 1546. Just because it was 472 years ago doesn't mean it's not still true, if it were true then. And it says that the Old and Vulgate edition should be held to be authentic, and no one is to dare or presume to reject it under any pretext whatsoever. I don't think the same could be said about the Jerusalem Bible, or the New Jerusalem Bible, or the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, or the New American Bible, or any other Catholic Bible that's based on the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Greek. So that concludes my my review of this old Tan Books Douay-Rheims Bible.